far as my parents go, I'm pretty sure they met at my family's bar that used to be on Central Avenue. It was called the Turf Bar, which was a nice blue collar working man's type bar back in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s. And it eventually turned into an adult theater right next to the Sonic on Central, just a little east of San Pedro. But that's an environment that I grew up in, just hours and hours and hours and hours every week, and that was something I remember shit from a very young age, from a very young age until, oh man, 16, something like that. Yeah, a lot of other kids were going to high school and doing high school stuff. I was in these bars with a couple people who became really good friends of mine with their parents who were also alcoholics. You know, a lot of people that worked in and around the area, a lot of mechanics, a lot of, you know, people from the base, a lot of during the state fair, you know, the horse racing people and the carnies. And other than that, it reminded me of a maybe a slight step up in the crowd from the movie Barfly, where people just that's where they came and hung out. You know what I mean? That's where they, you know, probably a lot of alcoholics, but they seemed a lot more. In my mind, a lot more harmless. I grew up in the Dallas and Marquette area off of Central right there in the La Mesa neighborhood. So, you know, most of my life I was shuffled around between my mother and father, but my father actually had, I guess what we would consider a little more stable as he didn't move around. He had his place that he stayed at, whereas when I was with my mother, you know, it was moving from place to place to place to place. So I think from fourth grade until sophomore in high school, I probably went to at least three or four schools every year between here and in Arizona. When my family sold the bar here, they went and started a new one in Arizona, and my mom went out there to work and just you know just move around from different parts in Phoenix and Glendale and Scottsdale and the surrounding areas, get behind on the rent or you know face some hardships and then move to another place and then move to another place, and it was just kind of you know this lifestyle that you get used to where you know okay, it's time to pack up and move. Let's get adaptable. My main peer group was like I had about two or three like really close friends who were all in that area, and you don't recognize it as a bad place because it's your home. It's just your place, and so it takes other people to come in and like have that shock and awe moment on their face when you tell them where you're at or tell them to come over and they see some of the things that might be a little different than what they experience in their day-to-day life. You know, then you start realizing like why are you acting so weird about where we're at? Yeah, to me it was just my daily life, right? And it was exciting, and you know it was sometimes it felt a little weird, and I was just like, yeah, this probably isn't what a 10 or 12-year-old should be doing or experiencing, but it's definitely giving me a rush. I think about that a lot, and I drove through there yesterday. Every once in a while, I'll drive through there and look at my dad's old place, or drive through where memorable things happened, or where my cousins lived, or the apartments that my friends were in and stuff, and just you know, it's fun to have those memories and see where it's at now, and it really hasn't changed too much. You know, different faces, different people, maybe some different drugs or whatever in the neighborhood, but you know, it was home to me, and you know, a lot of weird shit. A lot there definitely some bad shit, but for the most part, that's where most of my childhood memories were made or were stemmed from. My dad was a lifetime alcoholic, but I guess he was as functional as you could get. He kept the same job for 35 years, but would drink in the morning, come home, drink at lunch, drink at night, and he hung around with like what I would consider now like this band of misfits who were just kind of like him, right? So on the weekends, if they weren't at the bar together, they were all like, you know, a block or two away from where we lived or hanging out at this apartment complex or hanging out over there. And so you get to know their kids and their family and you see their dysfunction and like, oh, their dysfunction is like my dysfunction. And you bond with, you know, your peers in that way. And, you know, while they're drinking all day up until all night, we're just, you know, running the streets and playing football on the asphalt and going to the park or just, you know, walking for hours and hours and hours around the city and just I don't know, making our own fun. I had a pretty solid core group of friends. My buddy James, who kind of grew up in the same situation, but his family was more up in the Chelwood and Lomas area. I guess my longest friendship is with my buddy Ted Johnson, who lives out of state, but him and I met, I think, in the fifth fifth grade at the bar. His dad was an alcoholic who used to work at a body shop, which was the body shop that used to be Matucci's, which used to be Kelly's Brew Pub. Just the building south of it used to be a body shop. So he went to the bar and I met him there. And while the adults were drinking, we would just pump quarters into the video games there or go out in the parking lot. And we became fast friends. And then another friend of mine, Joe Moody, who I actually met in fourth grade at Emerson, his mom lived in the neighborhood and they became friends with my dad's friend circle. And so it was kind of the Jeff, Ted, and Joe show for a long time. Joe recently died from complications of alcoholism, but we were all in like within 2 blocks of each other. We didn't know that when we met at the bar, but it came to pass that like, oh yeah, you live at Marquette in Tennessee. Oh, you live at Texas and Marquette. Well, I live at, in the Dallas in between Marquette and Copper area. So we would hook up every chance we got and just do dumb shit that kids do in our neighborhood. All the parents knew each other, and it's actually really funny. Like, a regular parent, if you knew what our parents did, not that they were bad people, but just the extreme amount of addiction and like craziness that was going on. Like you wouldn't tell your kids, "Oh, I'm going to Joe or Ted's parents," and they'd be like, "Okay, great." Well, our parents, their norm was their peer group was, each other. The kids' peer group was each other. So when I said I'm going to Ted's or I'm going to Joe's, it was just like, okay, see you later. It's maybe they just thought, oh yeah, just go hang out with your friends and try to not get put in jail or something. I don't know. All of us were these little chameleons. All of us had, I think, grown up in this environment of having to adapt to your surroundings fairly quickly because there was a lot of transient, activity going on amongst our families, whether it be moving or getting evicted or just like, new friend groups or new schools or whatever. And so, Ted's dad lived in these apartments on the corner of Marquette and Tennessee. And Joe's mom lived at Texas, just a little south of Marquette. And my dad, on Dallas there. And I think all of them had some I don't know, they all lived there for a while, long enough to where I would say they could consider it their home. And so for us, it was like, okay, we were all stable enough, long enough to bond, if that makes sense, right? And so that's what we did. And we just hung out. When Joe was having problems at home, or maybe he was frustrated, he would call up or go get Ted or come get me. And then we go get Ted, or I'd go get Ted and then go get Joe or go get Joe. It just kind of like bounces off each other. And we found ourselves doing trying to act like we're a lot older than we were because, we grew up pretty much around adults most of our lives and thinking we knew more than we did, but also trying to support each other in the ways that we thought we could. Growing up in bars, I was exposed to alcohol at a very young age. And I think back in those days, and a lot of people in our generation would agree, it's just like, when you're sick, you get a hot toddy, with the whiskey and this and go to sleep. And oh, it's cute to watch, the kids walk around and sip on everybody's drinks. And, for me growing up in a bars, alcohol was really, really prevalent. And so it wouldn't be uncommon for me to go to the bar with my dad. And I'm talking like 6, 7, 8 years old. And I already was his bartender at home by then, and I was very aware of alcohol and like a lot of brands and stuff. And so every once in a while, I don't know, I think I would drink a 7 and 7 because my grandmother drank that, and I think the 7 Up made it taste good. So go to the bar and maybe once or twice a night I get that, and so I was exposed to that, and I stole my brother's weed when I was like 9 or 10, and took it to school and rolled a pregnant guppy joint in the bathroom and started smoking then. And then so that was probably when it all started. Definitely became a daily smoker after that. The alcohol, it was kind of like it was there and I would do it, but I think I was so by a certain age I was just like, oh man, I don't want to be like my parents. I see what it's done. I'm never going to be an alcoholic like that. But instead I just started doing everything else. The only times I drank, even through high school and stuff, was I drank with a purpose, and that was to get drunk. I wasn't like, let's have a glass of wine with dinner. I wasn't like that. I didn't think of it in those terms. I think of like drinking as a means to an end. I'm going to drink to get drunk, and subconsciously maybe there was something having to do with addiction there, but I felt like that was more the drugs. Alcohol was just like, yeah, drink to get drunk and that's it. I think maybe during some heavy stimulant abuse, I would abuse alcohol quite a bit to come down. And I think maybe once or twice I kind of started feeling my body shaky a little bit and I would move off of it, but alcohol was never the go-to for me. In New Mexico back then, it really didn't matter how old you were. If your family was with you in the bar, they could order you a drink and you could drink it. And so there was no breaking the law. If you were with your guardian or your parent, they could order you 10 shots of whiskey and you could drink it legally. Those days were very, very different. You know what I mean? And we didn't know what we know now about all kinds of stuff. And so I don't think anybody, those are the days of like smoking at the pit when basketball games were going on. People would smoke in hospitals. Like we didn't have the best decision making. Granted, there was a lot of probably unintentional and maybe careless mistakes made, but at the same time, I think it made us a fairly tough generation and pretty resilient and pretty resilient. And I'm not just talking like as a consequence of like dysfunctional parents and alcoholism, because there were a lot of perfectly quote unquote normal families doing stuff that today we'd be like, yeah, that's probably not a great idea. But, kids were resilient. The nuclear family was starting to dissolve a little bit. A lot of the latchkey kids were starting to emerge, a lot of independence amongst kids, the punk rock movement coming out of like the hippie peace, love, and understanding movement, heavy metal, all that stuff. And so it all lent to this kind of attitude that we had towards life.